Brent, at least in my opinion, you've been one of the most open and non-judgmental and caring people that I've ever met in the field of ufology. How have you been able to maintain this balance when you know you've heard people lie and hoax things, and some of them even delusional stories? How can you do that? How can you maintain such a balance when you hear the delusions and lies mixed with some that are truly genuine stories?
Well, of course, it's a process, an educational, gradual process. You go through this, and of course, you talk about lies and delusions, and sometimes you get caught up in it. You don't even realize that some of this stuff is what you're saying it is, and some of it you just kind of go through and you suspect or come to suspect. But I found a lot of people out there that was telling things that, first of all, I became pretty well convinced that they did believe it themselves, and that there was, the phenomena there. Of course, I always had a problem with the crash saucer stories. I didn't come across really that many. I know, of course, around Cincinnati, Ohio, I had talked on the phone through the Wilhelms with Len Stringfield, who back in '75, I think he was just getting into that area. He, of course, a lot of people don't realize that he had done a lot of other just conventional field investigations of all sorts of UFO entity cases going back to the 1950s. And, of course, he wrote the book Situation Red, yeah. Which I think was about it covered a lot of the 1973 sightings. I think it came out probably in '75.
Mm-hmm.
But there's a lot of information in that book about all sorts of very interesting UFO close encounters, entity, and covers a lot of the parapsychological data. He was very, very open-minded. But, of course, a lot of us get in this field, and if we're not careful, we get into a certain area that we just kind of get lost in. And
well, now Leonard Stringfield died this year, and I know you know that you wrote basically an obituary on him. But now, was he not one of the biggest proponents for crash saucers around?
Well, I think that he was. He certainly developed. He had a lot of contacts, and he encouraged people to come to him with these stories. And he would periodically put out a booklet based, on the details of what people were telling him across the country. And of course, there was no way for us to know who these people were. Of course, he protected their identity, which is a responsible, appropriate thing that a person should do in these situations. I know that Charles Wilhelm, who had been friends with him, along with his wife Jerry, had become very skeptical of some of these stories. And Charles started out as a believer in a lot of these things, I believe. And when he was growing up in the area that he'd heard stories of people had. One I remember, I think there was 2 stories he'd heard from people claiming they had seen bodies at Wright-Patterson. And one of these had been a lady who had worked there and had a terminal illness, and I think he was mowing her lawn, and she told him this story. And
is that the old Hangar 18 or 19 story?
Yeah.
Hangar 19 story?
Something like that. I believe, in fact, it's mentioned in Situation Red, these stories that was told to Charlie. But anyway, he became, back in the late 70s, early 80s, very skeptical. In fact, you can find some of his letters in Jim Moseley's Saucer Smear regarding his criticism of Len Stringfield's ideas, along with Moore and Stan Friedman and others.
Let me go back to my original question here, and that it was that I see that you've remained very non-judgmental and very caring in the light of meeting people that have genuine stories and then meeting some that are clearly not genuine. They have some ulterior motive, whatever it may be, in telling their stories. And I'm still curious, how have you said it's a process, but how can you maintain your balance and stay the way you are?
Well, you've got to be I don't know. Because some people, it's in their personality makeup. You've got to try to be open and listen. Of course, I've been I guess an introverted type personality and geared more to listening than talking. Okay, one of the things I like that John Keel has written was that much of the problem with a lot of people in the UFO investigative field is they would go out and meet witnesses, and they would conduct conversations instead of investigations. And I know from being with other people in the UFO field, I was with one here in Tennessee, not you.
Yeah, okay.
This man was a former city judge, a columnist for a newspaper, and you would have thought that he would have known better. But I was there. We went out and met these people who had a UFO sighting, and right off the bat he began to tell them about his belief in these extraterrestrial beings, where they came from, what they looked like. And, I'm standing back and I'm looking at their expressions, and I'm realizing, that they're probably, they're just kind of holding back the laughter, And after a while, he stopped talking, and then we heard the details. But of course, by that time, and I believe it was a genuine story. But if they had not been real down home good people, I mean, they had an opportunity certainly to have said, yes, yeah, we know those people.
Yeah.
And,
of course, that's been one of the raps, or one of the criticisms against our whole field, that people that do regression hypnosis kind of implant the memories, or occasionally will lead the person giving the experience into telling the investigator what the investigator wants to hear. That is to confirm their belief system.
Right, and that was clearly, in that case and others, situations I've been involved with, I've seen that, happen too often. And so, really, I think one of the best approaches is the unstructured interview, where you ask them, what kind of unusual experiences you've had? Because I know in Florida, with this person I went with, that I learned some interesting things from. And she was an experiencer herself, as well as a researcher. And we went to this lady's home who had seen this disc-shaped object 2 nights in a row. And she asked her, have you had any psychic experiences? And the lady said, no. Well, as she talked, and we listened, she began to tell about a time she attended a seance. And one of the people, their face changed. And then there was a time that someone had died, and she visited the gravesite, and this bird landed on the headstone, and just a lot of unusual things. Then we learned that the telephone had done strange things the night the UFO passed over, and she was going to call for help, and she couldn't get through, and it was doing very unusual things. So pretty soon we had a case history of all sorts of unusual, paranormal sounding events in this person's life.
In all of your years, I know you've told me some of your experiences that you've had, and some of them are pretty scary. Some of them were meaningful coincidences or synchronicities, and I know at some time in our conversations here we'll talk about synchronicity. But what's the scariest time you've ever had in all of your investigations and all of your experiences in this field?
Scariest time?
Yeah, what's the most frightening thing that's ever occurred?
Well, first thing that comes to mind, it's not exactly what a lot of people would think. It's kind of a humorous event. I was down in Brooksville, Florida in '75, and I was with Ramona and Dwayne Hebner. And Ramona is the individual I'm talking about earlier who lived in Mayport. Well, they were heavy into Bigfoot at this time, and we were parked out in their pickup truck near a pasture where Bigfoot, it was supposedly frequented. It was pitch black, and I've heard all these stories, talked with someone who claimed they'd seen something earlier in the day, and so there we are. The windows are down. It's pitch black. We're listening. I'm on the passenger side and just kind of, listening. And I didn't realize in this pasture there was a cow, and all of a sudden it snorted and made a movement, and I just about made a new roof.
Did you folks take off pretty rapidly then? How did you find out it was a cow?
Well, I jumped, and it really genuinely scared me, and Ramona laughed and told me, "Brent, that's just a cow."
Mm-hmm. I think a more serious question here. What do you think about government conspiracy in this field? Do you think the government's really concealing the truth about UFOs?
Well, I've tried to remain open on that. I can see where the government would routinely classify all information, a lot of information, so that they could study it in depth or get it to their experts, make some kind of an analysis of the data before they maybe went public with a lot of information, if they ever decided to.
Okay.
But of course, the military routinely classifies, a lot of information. It doesn't necessarily mean that it's a conspiracy.
Right.
It's just the military way.
Well, actually, that's the way of government. I've worked with government for so long that I know that is the government way. And there are files, and prisons are a place where I've been a lot. There are files in prisons that are sealed. You cannot get into those files. And there is information contained in them, of course, not about UFOs, but a lot of information they don't want the public to have access to. So, do you believe that there is a government conspiracy or not? You're saying that, yes, they do have information classified. And I'm trying to pin you down a little bit here.
Oh, well, there could be people who have been in the government, maybe who had experiences or were close to situations, that maybe have tried to retain this information, channel it a certain way. I mean, there's so many different branches of government, know. And I think ufologists have always had a problem pinning down who was behind the supposed conspiracy of silence, which there's really no proof for. Sure, maybe the CIA has watched certain groups, see where they were going with what they were saying. After all, they were speaking out against the government. I think the NICAP was really hard on the Air Force, and APRO was thinking in terms of CIA, and they, weren't even looking at the same agencies. But bottom line is that no, not like what a lot of people in the field have been claiming.
So you believe there may be a group of people in the government, in some level, that have some information about this?
I could see where some would have retained. Probably a lot of it's been lost. Even some of the Blue Book records apparently are no longer intact.
Yeah. How could that happen? I mean, what does that mean? How could that happen?
I mean, well, governments, big organizations, agencies, things on paper get
you run out
lost.
of space, and it gets
somebody maybe borrowed a file and didn't put it all back, or didn't put it back at all, or maybe some people of this, maybe an interested group, went home with it, never brought it back.
Yeah. How do you view the present situation in ufology? The current situation in this field, how do you view it?
Well, I have always really tried to stay out of the politics, because there's so much, well, I think as Eileen Garut said recently, a lot of negativity and a lot of chaos. I know sometimes I know that debate and discussion is good, but I would read like Jim Mosley's Saucer Smear, and it would actually depress me, because these guys weren't just debating and discussing. There was a lot of nastiness. There was no constructivity to it. And so I would just kind of like quietly go about my own quest, my own investigation, and
Whitley Strieber, of course, talked a lot about some of the nastiness in ufology, and I believe he kind of backed out of it for a while, which he's back in now, I think, to some extent. But the present situation, you think, is just nasty and splintered somewhat?
Yeah, I think, of course, a lot of people are what's really disturbing is the people that, like in Saucersmear, you can identify really a lot who are just interested in making themselves heard and inflating their ego up. And everybody likes to have recognition, but to do it at the expense of all these other people, there's a right way, a wrong way, a constructive and an unconstructive way to go about presenting your ideas and being heard, and a lot of them just are acting like little toddlers, little kids throwing temper tantrums. And won't name any names, but
okay.
You know who they are.
In recent years, you've become increasingly interested in Native American issues, and somehow this, at least in your frame of reference, ties together with ufology. And as you know, I have certain belief systems that where Native American issues tie into. But what's the relevance of Native American issues to ufology? Where are you going with all this Native American information?
Okay, for one thing, you've got perceptions and you've got beliefs that are similar, and they incorporate some of the same.
For example?
Well, like for example, where you've been out in Yakima, Washington State, around the Yakima Indian Reservation, the sightings, the Bigfoot, and how it ties in with their some of their old Indian beliefs and folklore. And this is something that's not just occurred recently. This has a historical perspective to it.
A long-term historical perspective.
And so you have situations like that, and it's interesting to see how that compares with, like, the current flying saucer sightings and the beliefs that we have today. And I think we can learn a great deal. Of course, this is what Val E. did with his book back in '69, Passport to Magonia. Okay, and of course with Val E., Magonia was this complex, goes back centuries, belief by the people in these cloud ships and these beings, these supernatural beings named Magonians who lived in the upper atmosphere in the heavens. And they would occasionally come down, and there are even accounts of where they appeared to people. They were human-like, and they would, in fact, there were some people one time, in one account, I think it was a Roman priest, wrote this account back, this was, I think, back 800 and something A.D., I'm not exactly sure just exactly when this was, but in the account there was, I think, 3 people that were going to be burned at the stake by these peasants in this French town because they said they had seen these people come from one of these ships. Okay, so to bring this up to date, or try to anyway, to kind of correlate these things, John Keel, not so many years ago, back in the 60s, was trying to get to the bottom of this, and he thought perhaps the best way he could do it was to actually confront a man in black. He was having quite a number of cases in Long Island, in West Virginia, and in some cases I think he arrived on the scene like within an hour of a supposed visitation. And they were very much human-like. People thought that they were Air Force agents, except that Keel kept noticing certain physical similarities that didn't coincide with any people in the Air Force. In fact, he noted the similarities, like the oriental features, long fingers, as being more indicative of what he called the parahuman entities or element. And with Native American, the Hopi Indians, the Kachina ceremonies, and they wear masks, and supposedly the Kachinas are human-like, and they may appear at the ceremonies, and one day, I think at the final ceremony, one is supposed to take its mask off and reveal itself for being truly a spirit. So maybe all this, and a lot of their beliefs, of course, they talk about the Pleiades, and they have concepts similar to the reincarnation concepts of the Far East. It's interesting to see how all these different cultural beliefs and factors may tie into, the current phenomena that we're experiencing. This is what Valley tried to do, and this is how I think it could tie in with Native American spirituality.
Of course, I've written some about Native American rituals, and that's, of course, my involvement's a slightly different thing. But I know you have been doing sweat lodges, participating in sweat lodges. You also have been involved in some other fire rituals and so on. And could you tell us a little bit about that? I mean, not everybody is familiar with what that is, and maybe some of the listeners want to hear some about what you're doing.
Okay, well, of course, my wife Joan is part Native American.
Which
would be she thinks Cherokee and Creek.
Okay.
And she has a deep interest in Native spirituality, and reads a great deal. And we also have, at the present time, we're attending a monthly gathering down in Alabama, which involves sweat lodge ceremonies.
Mm-hmm.
And
what do you do in the ceremonies?
Well, in the ceremony, we have a hut that's made of like willow branches that are bent over, and it's made into like a hut, and then these blankets are put over the frame of this hut, and we heat up these rocks till they're just glowing white hot, and then they're brought into the center of the lodge, which there's a pit in the floor. I'm kind of getting ahead of myself or behind myself with some of this, but anyway, there's a pit in the middle of this, and this is symbolic of like the center of the universe and the womb of Mother Earth. And the participants gather around in this sweat lodge, and it's physically good, of course, to get the toxins out of your body, and it's afterwards you feel invigorated and refreshed. It also alters consciousness when you're in there, and you begin to see hypnagogic images and such.
Could you be a little more specific, or give us some examples of that?
You begin to see, after you've done it a while, of course, you do change. It's your physical body that's undergoing this rapid change, the dehydration, and you start to. And of course, it may not happen right then. It may be afterwards that suddenly this great idea, this mental picture pops into your head, and you can tie it into this ceremony. In
an issue of alternate perceptions, you had talked about a case of synchronicity. I believe you were doing a fire ceremony near Waynesboro at Indian Creek, and an incident, a meaningful coincidence occurred where you saw what I believe you have described as your first UFO. Is that correct?
Well, it was certainly the first UFO. I've been to this area quite a number of times. Mm-hmm. And it was the first UFO that I'd seen there. And it's been the only UFO that I've seen there near Collingwood, Tennessee, in an area that there had been a lot of UFO sightings. I had selected the idea of doing this ceremony there because there had been this UFO and paranormal activity, and I thought it would be interesting to see what would happen. And the fact that I did see something, unusual light, I thought was very interesting, and it was a UFO. I couldn't identify it. I have seen unusual lights at other times too, but never bothered to really write a report up on it or get excited. But this, I really felt, was a synchronicity in what we saw. In fact, there was. I believe that everybody there was 7 of us. I believe all of us saw it. I'm not sure about the one who was doing the actual fire ceremony himself.
What did you see? Can you describe it?
Well, what was interesting too is that the west was behind me, and I'm up to this fire, and it's just at the beginning of the ceremony.
What time of the day was it?
This was around 8 o'clock in the evening.
Okay.
And so I turned away from the fire and I looked to the west. And if I hadn't done this, I never would have seen it. But it was a white light rising straight up. It was across. There was a creek that ran by where we were, and this was on the other side. It was going straight up into the air, and I had no idea what it was, but I knew it was something unusual. Now you can see a plane sometimes, as it comes in, and it'll come in slowly. But this thing was going straight up and like a straight line. And I got the impression it couldn't be that far off. I expected that we would be hearing some kind of noise or something because it seemed like it would have been close. And so I started, I immediately told everybody to look, and they would have missed it otherwise too. And so my wife saw it, my daughter, and I know there was 3 people there with us that also saw it across from us, and they all observed this light.
How did it affect them?
Well, of course, they had seen unusual lights there over the years, so this was just another light.
Yeah, just another light.
But they thought it was quite interesting, and it was bright light, a white to me. Someone said that it had kind of a greenish tint to it. It got dim, and then it got bright again. It kind of pulsated. And then the second time it got bright, still going straight up, it dimmed out and didn't come back on. And my first thought was, well, it's stuck behind a cloud. And I looked around, and there may have been some, near the horizon, but I looked up and I could see there were stars, a few stars. It wasn't a real bright star-studded night, but there were stars. So as bright as this light was, it shouldn't have just disappeared like it did. And so there was no sound, and very unusual the way that it just, shot up. And so I thought, well...
Okay. I want to return to something you said much earlier in our interview here. And that is, you mentioned Fife, Alabama. And Fife, Alabama, of course, was, during the early 90s, has been the site of alleged cattle mutilations. But what is the earlier involvement of Fife, Alabama? What is some of the earlier history there, if you can tell us in just a few moments?
Well, apparently the people of Fife, Alabama have, for a long time, going back to the 60s, and I don't know prior to that, but have had UFO sightings. And Keel, back at that time, which I didn't know until just a couple of years ago, that we got a letter from John Keel, and he mentioned that he had been through Fife, Alabama back in the 60s. So the activity there is, I guess, an ongoing situation. It's not a new phenomenon. And of course, it was a couple of years ago that we were in Madison, Alabama, talking to a policeman who had worked in Fife, and told about how, to the people of Fife, that these UFO sightings are not so unusual to them. They accept it and go on.
All right. I have one. This is our last question for our last few moments here. Can you tell us what are your current beliefs about UFOs? Where are you at right now in the entire UFO phenomenon?
Where I'm at? Oh boy. Well, I've always tried to remain objective, to remain open-minded, and it's difficult sometimes. I would like to have just a belief where I could just say, okay, this is it. I can go right straight down the line with all the arguments and have all these answers, and it all fits neat and tidy, a little package there where everything has an explanation for it. And the UFO phenomena, on the surface, when you first get involved, you think that it's going to be that kind of a package, but the more you get involved in it, the more different aspects and facets of it you find, and it'll shake up your belief systems. And I found that more answers I get, I have even more questions that arise.
Well, Brent, I want to thank you, and I know our listeners have enjoyed it, and thanks again.